Alrighty. Okay, cool. I'm not sure where this is going to go. It might go pretty long. If anybody joins me, tell me if the stream is okay. I'm not worried about the video quality as much as the audio. So hopefully someone will join me and tell me that it's good. All right. So I wanted to talk about a couple different things related. So the title of the talk, Amnesty, the Elephant Comes to Thanksgiving. I scheduled the stream for this coming Sunday called Sunday Supper. That's sort of an homage to my grandmother, Arlene, who would always Sunday supper at 2 p.m. And for the various meanings of the word, it was dinner. It was a big dinner. Would last about 2 hours. You'd get there at 2, you'd leave at 4. That was basically Sundays at my grandma's. And I didn't always live in Utah. I was born here. I moved back in 9th grade. But when I was a kid, I lived in Florida with my family, my mom, stepdad, and my technically half siblings. But I was not adopted by my stepdad, but my mom gave me his last name for many years. So I was Kate Cook. And Godina's my husband's name. So I'm even a mutt in just my aliases, but this is the real me. And I'm happy to be talking about some things that go on day to day and some stories of, my past. And so I decided to do this stream tonight, Amnesty, the Elephant Comes to Thanksgiving, because I was thinking about my family. Today is November 1st, 2022. It's the Day of the Dead. My husband's family is Mexican, but they don't really celebrate too much. So I'm not trying to adopt anyone else's culture. I just want to, pay respect to it. And so I was thinking a lot about my family lately and all the family drama. And, I was thinking about how you might have a archetype of every type in your family at your big family dinners, if you happen to have those. And I think it's interesting because the last few years with people not getting together with their families, etc., there have been a lot of great divides at family dinner tables, and even people being excluded from being invited to dinner. And I don't want to invite my dad to Christmas dinner. I don't want to have these boring, quiet, uncomfortable, obligatory events. I'm just so over it. It's like there's some things that I genuinely want to go to, but I've been getting really frustrated that so many conversations seem to be so superficial, right? Hi, Thomas. Thanks for being here. So many things seem to be superficial and just everybody just come to dinner. It'll mean a lot to mom. Let's try and not argue for the next couple of hours. But it's always uncomfortable, you know, and like I had some fun times with my family growing up, but thinking back on it, it's like, man, there were so many things going on under the surface that I never understood. And so memory is funny because it does play tricks on you a little bit. You do have to be aware of your biases with your own memory, your own, manners of speaking. And I say biases because you change. You know, it, I think at different times in your life you have different bias. All right. Um, so of course, when I was a kid, I wanted everything to be that fairy tale. And I was a voracious reader at like 6 years old. So I was reading as much as I could get my hands on. And I think what that does is not only does it inform you about real things, but it gives you the opportunity to learn empathy because you're putting yourself in other people's circumstances, and you're able to learn lessons that you can't live that many lifetimes. So that's the benefit of reading fiction, and I've always enjoyed it. Now that I am watching people like Professor Hamamoto and um, Alison McDowell and John O'Loughlin on Macduff Lives, and just so many different people from different walks of life, but they do speak to these common threads. And so that's really informed me. Oh, hi, CJ. Thank you so much for coming. So I think because I come from a really diverse background in my family, I always read everything I could get my hands on. I grew up in a community that was also very diverse, because when I moved to Florida, um, there were people from all over the country that moved to Central Florida, basically because Lockheed Martin built a big facility very close to me. And the Orlando Magic became a basketball team. And my dad got a job for the Orlando Magic, their very first season in 1989. And so I realize now what was going on when I was about 5 years old, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, was they were building these new, now we can call them smart cities. It was new ways of integrating everything with, toll roads and expanding freeways and building out suburbia where it had never been before. So it was like a big time of growth. And you can look back at just all the sports teams that popped up in these smaller markets. And you can kind of parallel it to everything else, just starting to grow, expand, people leaving where they were from, moving across the country for new jobs. That was becoming common. So when I moved back to Utah, I always thought it was really surprising that there were people living here that had never left Utah. They'd never left at all. And so I thought, like, I guess now it makes more sense to me because I really haven't traveled much in the last 10 years or so. I've wanted to be a homebody. But yeah, family dinners, they must be different when you're already spread out across the country. and it's a big to-do to come together and to gather. And so when I was young, that was always so special. It was so special to get to travel to see family. Um, and honestly, like now with kids and just being busy, sometimes I just like roll my eyes at the idea of another family dinner. So I'm kind of being cynical about that. But I did want to talk about um, the big article that came out on Halloween in the Atlantic by Emily Oster. And she's an economist. She works for Brown University. Um, she's like a mommy blogger, but she gets picked up by all these different news outlets, syndicated on like Slate and Atlantic and whatever. They pick up all the stuff she originally wrote on her blog or whatever. And so she wrote the big article that everybody's been freaking out about. Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. We need to forgive one another for what we did and said when we were in the dark about COVID. Okay, so everybody's been spouting about this. I looked up real quick a couple of other like just news outlets, and it was funny because the Wall Street Journal, their take was like not so fast. But then the National Review, which like all this stuff was paywall blocked, so I wasn't going to pay them money to read their articles, but the headlines spoke volumes because the National Review is like, hell no. So I found another article that I wanted to read that was in response to, the let's declare a pandemic amnesty. Come on, guys. We just didn't know. So this is linked in my description. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read a good chunk of it. This is by Mary Harrington. She's a contributing editor at Unheard. With Freddie, has a YouTube channel. I don't watch him too much, but I thought this article was a good kind of counter narrative, picking apart Emily Oster. Now, the article begins with Mary Harrington recollecting the time around 2016. That was November 2016 when Trump was elected, and around that time was also Brexit. So things were really crazy at that time. And this author explains she was very pregnant, and she had read Emily Oster's pregnancy book, Expecting Better. I never read that book, although I was pregnant at the time myself. My son was born in May 2016. And, and she kind of goes on about just like a little bit of her experience. She read what that book is about. On Monday, the same author published an essay arguing for a pandemic amnesty. We should, she suggests, move on from the conflict, fear, uncertainty, and doubt that roiled the pandemic years and focus instead on the urgent issues of today. But while I can understand why Oster might wish to put all the COVID-era bitterness back into a box labeled the common good, her effort to do so has not been well received, and this is a consequence of the very policies which Oster would now like everyone to forgive and forget. Reading avidly in the run-up to my daughter's birth, it was already clear to me that many of the so-called mummy wars are proxies for class issues. Against this emotive backdrop, Oster's book felt like a refreshing counterbalance. It's astonishing, in fact, how recently it still felt possible to weigh competing claims on the evidence and settle on something reasonable. But a great deal has changed since then, and it's easier to understand why, and it's easier to understand why when you consider the difference between trying to settle the mummy wars via science and trying to agree upon public health policy during a pandemic. If the mummy war is a class war writ small, COVID policy followed the same dynamic. It was, in fact, a class war writ so large it encompassed minute micromanagement of nearly every facet of everyday life for years on end, and doled out material consequences for dissenters, and it was all justified with reference to the supposedly neutral domain of science. This tracks a slow convergence of supposedly neutral governance with partisan class differences that was well underway before the virus, a phenomenon exhaustively documented following the two plebeian revolutions of Brexit and Trump. These events gestated concurrently with my daughter. I won't rehash the debates here, save to note that they represented the first shot across the bows of the end of history belief that technocracy could be genuinely neutral and based in objective evidence. In questioning this doctrine, the mutineers dragged an incipient class war into the open between what is between what N.S. Lyons characterizes as the virtuals of the laptop class and the physicals, whose work is more rooted in the material world. Amid this conflict, Oster's plea for amnesty is unlikely to be heard, since under those appeals to neutral science, much of COVID policy served in practice as a virtual counter-volley to the 2016 uprisings. Please close my door. You can save that. Okay. Sorry. In its most rarefied, dematerialized virtual form, the contours of that counter-volley are captured by a short series of declarations of faith. This text, a kind of Nicene Creed for virtuals, first appeared in response to Trump's election and has multiplied across posters, T-shirts, etc. And signs stuck into the front lawns of the faithful. The virtuals creed reads as follows. In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. Each of these dicta sounds unimpeachable in theory, but is far more contentious in practice. No human is illegal, for instance, sounds true, but how do we manage the welfare state without a means of distinguishing between citizens and non-citizens? When this law sign first appeared, I could have given you a critical rundown of the political pitfalls and ideological sleights of hand buried in all those dicta, bar the claim that science is real. Since then, though, I've seen this line in the Virtuals Creed weaponized without compunction as a bludgeon to enforce a moral consensus that wasn't scientific and wasn't rational. This consensus was, instead, far more religious in character. Even famous and high-profile dissenters have faced harassment at its hands for airing topics that ought, you'd think, be within the scope of objective discussion. Okay, I'm sorry. She brings up the notorious celebrity podcaster Joe Rogan has faced calls to be canceled after asking COVID questions. Unheard's Freddie Sayers was censored for interviewing lockdown dissenter and former WHO cancer lead Dr. Carol Sikora. Nor is having expertise or evidence on your side much of a defense. Dr. Peter McCullough, a top American cardiologist, argued against vaccinating those with natural COVID immunity and voiced concerns about the effect of the COVID vaccine on cardiac health. For expressing such views, and despite evidence that natural immunity is more robust than the vaccine and that myocarditis is a recognized side effect of the vaccine, McCullough now faces being struck off by an American medical board. And this is my side note. Let's not forget Congress in the US declaring that it's likely a lab leak when people were losing social media accounts for even discussing the idea. Back to the article. Debate has been stifled. Obvious inferences from widely available evidence were ignored where these conflicted with settled virtual consensus. There was, for example, no rationale for mandatory vaccination once it became clear that, as acknowledged as far back as December 2021, by even the Virtuals House journal, the New York Times, vaccine didn't prevent virus transmission, and yet mandates remained in place across many locations long after that date. Indeed, around the time the New York Times article was published, Oster herself was advocating escalating pressure to vaccinate, from public shame to stopping the unvaccinated from traveling, working, or attending events. It may be optimistic of Oster and others of the virtual class to try to restore public faith that science is real, but it's also understandable. First, for reasons of self interest, those who drove COVID policy presented themselves not just as people doing their best, but as the sole bearers of rational truth and life saving moral authority. Doubtless, the laptop class would prefer that we judge COVID policy by intention, not results, lest too close an evaluation result in their fingers being prized from the baton of public righteousness. But the rot goes deeper still, for the very foundation of that moral authority is a shared trust in the integrity of scientific consensus. And COVID has left us in no doubt that there is a great deal of gray area between science and moral groupthink. Where science shades into the latter, British care workers and American soldiers and police officers dismissed for refusing a vaccination that doesn't stop transmission can attest that science is sometimes real, more in the sense of institutionally powerful and self-righteous than in the sense of true. This touches on another source of rage that many would doubtless like to forget, the asymmetry in whose shoulders bore the heaviest load. It wasn't the lawn sign people who bore the brunt of lockdowns. They could mostly work from home. Rather, lockdown shuttered countless small businesses permanently or burned them to the ground in lawn sign endorsed riots that were justified on public health grounds, even as others were fined for attending Holy Communion in a car park. Our journey to this point was, at every stage, narrated as the inescapable conclusion of science, which is real. But nearly 3 years out from the start of the pandemic, it looks a great deal more like the massed consensus of public health officials and their journalistic cheerleaders have delivered a public that is sicker, unhappier, and poorer across a host of measures. Oster lists among the urgent issues of the day the learning loss experienced by children as a consequence of COVID policy, with the youngest and poorest hardest hit. She notes the drop-off in routine vaccinations, also a consequence of COVID policy. To this list, we might add the rise in non-COVID excess deaths, also a consequence of COVID policy, not to mention the stagnant economy and the rocketing inflation rate. All these are downstream of a pandemic-era public discourse that felt like the Brexit Trump wars on steroids, because it was the Brexit war on steroids, a battle for a class dominance in which one side used its stranglehold on public institutions to frame censorship as fact-checking and all dissenters as stupid, unscientific, or actively hateful. It's not that we collectively tried to get it right and mistakes were made. It's that a self-righteous cabal arrogated to themselves a priestly right to determine the proper social order and to excommunicate those who didn't conform. The record in securing the common good speaks for itself. Public faith in objectively shared political ground was already dissolving. I know. I know, but I'm reading this comment. Well, what welfare state sounds like someone who's never needed welfare. Yeah, I know, but I do like a lot of this article. So public faith in objectively shared political ground was already dissolving while my daughter gestated. If the virtuals have a problem now, it's that their counter volley to Trump and Brexit consumed the last vestige of trust in that shared political ground, our faith in science. And the notion that such ground exists is the... I'm sorry, I don't read Latin. So obviously she doesn't need welfare because she's writing Latin. But in this light, Oster's call for amnesty can present itself as an effort to rebuild the neutral space of shared political endeavor after a period of conflict. But it reads as a continuation of now familiar efforts to weaponize the appearance of such neutrality and common purpose. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this lady is actually just like the perfect representation of like a point and a counterpoint. You know, this woman is definitely not This is I'm talking about the article I've been reading, Mary Harrington. So I mean, she's definitely she's writing for like an alt publication, but she's definitely not like a lower middle class working person, you know? I mean, yeah, writers don't make a lot of money, but I'm sure she had like help going to college. She's in a bunch of student debt. I don't know. I'm not trying to judge her. But I appreciated, she's making this counter argument that the article just feels ugh. It just feels so stupid. And yeah, like Thomas is saying in my chat, science is a method, not dogmatic edicts. So we all have to be careful of those. And I am guilty of that shit too. But the original article that blew everything up by Emily Oster, this is so weird. Okay, I'm not going to read her whole article either, but she says, I've been reflecting on this lack of knowledge thanks to a class I'm co-teaching at Brown University on COVID. We spent several lectures reliving the first year of the pandemic, discussing the many important choices we had to make under conditions of tremendous uncertainty. Some of these choices turned out better than others. To take an example, close to my own work, there's an emerging, if not universal, consensus that schools in the U.S. were closed for too long. The health risks of an in-school spread were relatively low, but they didn't know. Right? She has another example. When vaccines came out, we lacked definitive data on the relative efficacies of the J&J shot versus the other mRNA options, but the mRNA vaccines have won out. But at the same time, people in public health were either neutral or expressed a J&J preference. This misstep wasn't nefarious, it was the result of uncertainty. So, none of this stuff is actually getting to like the other side of the issue, right? Either Mary Harrington or Emily Oster. They're just like the two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. Okay. More from Emily Oster. Given the amount of uncertainty, almost every position was taken on every topic, and on every topic, someone was eventually proved right and someone else was proved wrong. In some instances, the right people were right for the wrong reasons. In other instances, they had a prescient understanding of the available information. So that's weird to me because prescient means like to predict. Now, my argument is there were people who were raising alarms that had nothing to do with like this fear of uncertainty. They were actually like, hey, wait a second, what you guys are doing doesn't make any fucking sense under any circumstance. Now I was really like, I just kind of am gullible. And so I was like, oh man, this is messed up. I remember right before everything shut down, I was working at a basketball game and the Toronto Raptors were in town. And this was like March 9th or March 8th or March 9th, 2020. And everybody on the Toronto team was sick. Like the broadcasters and stuff, they were all sick. I had the sniffles, but I was feeling all right. I wasn't ill. I was like, oh, I thought it was kind of like a winter cold, So back then, you have to remember that like you would lose your job if you called out sick, My husband lost his job in February because they wanted him to go get a a doctor's note saying that he's sick, and he works in food service. So really, if you just have symptoms, there's a whole list of symptoms where you shouldn't come into work. It's against, health code working in food service if you have like a runny nose and stuff. Now, I don't have a food handler's permit to work at a basketball game. So if I feel okay, if I can walk and I can talk, I'm going to work. And I know how to like sneeze into a tissue and like be respectful of other people, But like I was crammed this close to people at work, and we were all sick. And I was like, well, if this COVID shit is happening, like I'll just really start worrying about it when it kills teenagers, And I told that to one of the people around. I was just like, I'm really not going to stress out about it. But I still, like, I wore the masks. I stayed home. I didn't hug my mom for 6 weeks. Like, she ended up getting the shots. I didn't, but like she's finally come around and been like, oh man, I think there was a lot of weird stuff going on around this. And so my family's really split because my dad still, just a few weeks ago, is trying to bribe my kids to want to get their shots so that they can go on a cruise or go on a vacation. And I just feel like that is so disrespectful when you know my position, and like there is information out there that kind of proves my concerns. But nonetheless, I just also wanted to mention, I have another link in the description to a conversation with John O'Loughlin and Dr. Dolores Cahill. And she's really interesting. She's somebody that was taken off of all social media because she was speaking out. And she comes from a science background. And she also comes from Ireland, where when she was growing up, what is Merck now, their company back in like the 70s, where this doctor was growing up, maybe earlier, they came to town and then the livestock started getting sick. So she's been privy to a farmer's case that spanned like a course of 20 years, trying to, make these multinational corporations accountable. So yeah, I don't know. I think it gets really dangerous when you start getting into these big ideas, because like obviously I'm not well versed in a lot of these topics. I'm listening to other people and I'm like sort of trying to both process it and spit it out at the same time. And so I sound like kind of a fucking idiot, but I'm just trying to work through this because this stuff is important. Like, even if I don't understand it, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of great people out there that are getting closer to being able to articulate everything. So I just wanted to comment because I think it's not so much about the idea that this lady writes an article about let's declare pandemic amnesty. It's almost like it's fodder for all of the alt media people to get all worked up about and cry about everything that's happened the last few years. And it's like this lady teaching a class to reliving the first year of the pandemic, discussing the many important choices we had to make under conditions of tremendous uncertainty. It's like ingraining that idea that there is going to be this mommy that will take care of you. Just listen to her. And even if she's contradictory at times, like just listen, always listen to her. And I have to tell you that one of the things I appreciate more than anything about becoming a mom is that it is humbling. You have never felt so stupid as when you are responsible for a kid and you don't know what they need because they can't communicate except by crying. And so you come to understand your child. When you're able to actually raise them, to actually be with them and come to know them, you learn their nonverbal communication. You come to understand what they mean when they're fumbling with their words. My son has a really rapid speech pattern. He's almost unintelligible. He's using huge vocabulary words that he can't pronounce very well. And thankfully, we got him into a speech program, but you know, his brain's just going too fast. He's got to try and slow down and be able to focus, you know. But even though nobody can really understand him, of course, I have learned how to understand him most of the time. Sometimes he's talking nonsense about video games, and has a great imagination, so he's writing his own video games in his head. And I'm like, Lou, you got to learn to write and type and get all this stuff out. You have such an amazing imagination. But you can tell he gets frustrated because sometimes we don't understand him. So it's about getting to know someone as an individual. And if you care, if you give a damn, you will adapt to them. You will work together with them. And so what I liked about Dolores Cahill is she was talking about the fundamentals of accountability is at the local level. And I'm very lucky because I had healthy kids. If I were on my own, I would be in the welfare state, but I do have family that's been able to help me out. But I hate asking them for help. It just shames me. I hate it. And so I've really tried to make shit happen on my own, and I've failed a dozen times. I've had so many big idea projects, and luckily I never went out and grifted a bunch of money from people to I'm not a great salesperson anyway, and I'm not trying to deceive anybody. So most of my programs were glass recycling and I wanted to do an artist collaboration thing. And it was funny because the year that Facebook came out, I was trying to have meetings with a handful of really young kids, like my younger brother and his friends, the real dirtbags. And I was trying to have meetings with them and try and engage them in a project. And it just fizzled out. And we were too young, too dumb, too high, smoking too much weed, But back then I was also volunteering for this this group called Peer Court, and it was kind of like a remediation for kids that were getting in trouble at school. And so it's like an alternative to juvie, and it was supposed to be kind of like a children's mentorship program. And in theory, it's a good idea, but I think it really was just an excuse to slough the time, put teenagers and 20-something-year-olds in charge of the remediation instead of actual social workers and people that were actually trained. So it was kind of fucked up, I think, how they were trying to run it. But I was such a hippy dippy. I wanted to believe in all that, but I remember telling the director of that program, she was, like, all proud that she came from the hippie generation, and I just said, "Well, I don't think that the hippies actually did anything." You know? So, I was starting to get disillusioned back then, but, it took me a few years. My friend Thomas has known me for years, and, he's been kind of trying to drag me along for, uh for a long time. But I think, for me, it's just important for me to process all this stuff. So I really appreciate that anybody else is out there that kind of gives a damn about me, um, and can understand that, yeah, I'm just an idiot, but I'm trying. But I think the big point is that, like, this just seems to be this tactical admission of fault and, like, a false sheepish apology. Like, it just feels so weird what they're trying to do now. Maybe it's because of the election coming up. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, I don't think it's like, oh, it was prophetic that somebody, like, was right about some things. No. These were scientists that had been in the field for many years. This woman, Dr. Dolores Cahill, um, she knew they were poisoning people with all kinds of weird stuff going on. She knew the mRNA trials in animals weren't going well. She was trying to warn people about this for a long time. So I think you should give a listen to her talk with McDupp. I really hope you do. I don't yet have, like, a streaming software that I'm using to be able to play videos and comment on them. I don't wanna mess with that right now, but, I do encourage you to listen to Dr. Kale. She's interesting, she's got another take, um, but she talks about the infiltration agenda upon all pillars of society, and going back to this localized system. And I do believe it's possible because, everybody really gets, like, all in a tizzy over stuff. But I can tell you, like, when things really matter, you rise to the occasion. And when I first told my now husband that I was pregnant, he was scared. He was young. I was pretty young. We were like, oh God, but I wanted I wanted our kids, and I told him, he may not be ready now, but he'll be ready, because we're gonna love the hell out of these kids, and we do, and they're awesome, and they challenge me, and I like that they challenge me. It's this is where I was trying to get at about an hour ago. Is that it's it's good that you recognize that your kids are thinkers and that they're a little tough because they're thinking, their brains are working. I remember the beginning of COVID, everybody was really wary of everything, and luckily there were a few neighbors around that they let our kids play together, because everybody was tiptoeing around it. You didn't know how people would take it. I was always very nervous about how people would take me because my kids had never gotten their shots, and so I just wouldn't mention it. Honestly, I would just uh, not say anything, because it's really nobody's fucking business. But I'm sorry for cursing a lot, but you know it's just too much. It's too much to just. I think there's a difference between kind and nice, and I think nice is when you're friendly to somebody's face, and the second they turn around, you're gonna talk shit about them or, um, throw them under the bus. I think kindness is really being yourself, and I'm so frustrated. I don't wanna just hold it in so that I can pander to everyone and be liked and loved by everyone. A lot of times I kind of play that character because I think it is in my nature to be mostly, like, friendly. I like people most of the time until they give me a reason not to, and even then, I give people plenty of, space, um, because I know one thing about mean people is that they can be the ones that are the most hurt and need a freaking break. But I think what we're really talking about is the infiltration of a truly nefarious system. And these authors, even the ones putting a really hard-hitting, like, counter narrative, they're still kind of speaking from this privileged position. And it's why I do the job I'm doing right now, because it's not like I want to be some martyr, and cry and do a YouTube channel where I just cry about how I can't get a job unless I get a shot. I was like, I just found a job that I could do without that requirement. And yeah, it fucking sucks some days, but it's making me strong. It's letting me see some beautiful things in the sky and in the mountains and the creeks and the rivers and being out in nature. And so there's definite benefits to what I'm doing besides just a paycheck to get by, you know. But I like being part of the working class. I like being part of the grunts. That's why in 20 years of production work, I never ever aimed higher than, like, I was an assistant director by name sometimes, but it was nothing like what that job is on a film set. It's nothing like what that job is on a commercial television set. I was working like the bottom of the bottom of production the whole time. And I loved it. I thought it was so cool. Um Sometimes I knew, like, it was stupid what we were selling. I was selling commercials all the time. But for the most part, I still thought, like, oh wow, I get paid to go see the spectacles that everybody else is paying to see. And I always thought it was interesting, like, pay attention to who's the advertisers, who's got the naming rights in the buildings, who's sponsoring these ads from all the different NBA teams. Um, there were just so many behind the scenes kind of things that I was tracking. So I wasn't really watching the games that much. I was watching everything else. So I'm grateful for that. There was some of the PBS bullshit that I was buying into, but I think it came from an authentic place. Like, I wanted to be able to build up local communities. I don't want people to be eating poison. I don't want them to be drinking poison. Um, I do want to be the matriarch of the family that can have everybody come over for dinner and everyone get along okay. But I don't know how we get to that point when most of the stuff that's put out there is like it's already got its built-in trigger device. So it's going to go off like on every paragraph, and just reinforce its message. So I don't know. I think that the more that we have these little groups, albeit like 2 or 3 of us talking, CJ, Thomas, myself, this is another brain we have here, and these little channels, these are the ones that are going to make it easier for other people to go and present their perspectives and have their gripes that in a space that, yeah, it's limited, and that's good because we don't need to always be going into this much depth at dinner time with grandma when she doesn't understand it, you know? Sometimes we do have to be like, okay, yeah, I get it. You don't want to have a conversation that's any deeper than the surface level. Like, okay. And I think as long as these people aren't mean, like, yeah, maybe I'll begrudgingly, like, uh, you know, be nice to them. But it still really pisses me off. If they really want us to, like, forgive and forget when, my dad told me, well, if you don't get the COVID shots, like, what if Zev died? I mean, that's so manipulative. So, and he's still harping at me about it. So, I mean, part of me, I just know that he just doesn't get it and he's not going to ever get it. But at least if he's going to try and be nice, like, I will try my damnedest to be nice, but it's hard. It's killing me right now. It's killing me. And my mom and dad have been divorced like pretty much my whole life, and yet they've been able to, like, sort of get along at Christmas time. And I don't know, she's like, tell John he can't come to Christmas dinner. So I'm just still, like, stuck in the middle of my parents' divorce, and I'm almost 40. So that's what came out in all this Amnesty shit. And I'm sorry that I can't be a little bit more polished and professional on here, but I don't really think that's what's needed. I think we got to get to some of the raw stuff and really hash it out. So yeah, I appreciate you guys, and I hope that you'll check out the McDuff Dolores Cahill chat and let me know what you think about that whole take. And I'm going to do a talk hopefully on Sunday. I'm going to have a real shitty couple of days coming up because it's going to be snowing or raining all day, possibly the next couple of days. So I'm going to have extra gear in the car and take breaks and count all my blessings because it's not that bad for me. And thanks again for letting me get this all out. I really appreciate it. Almost went an hour. So yeah, thank you. Good night.